Hey there, it's Jason from Codemanship with another video diary entry. Before we get into today's topic, if you're enjoying these videos or finding them useful, you can ring the bell for notifications, subscribe to this channel, always more stuff to come. Now, what I wanted to talk about today is stubbing and mocking, in particular stubbing and mocking using mock objects frameworks. So I've got a test here that's using Mockito, a very popular framework for creating mock objects and stubs in Java. And I've got one test that's using Mockito to mock and stub 3 different interfaces. Now, you don't need to worry too much about what this test is about. It's just really about whether or not a send method on this alert interface is called by the thing that we're testing. That's our stock monitor. And it's creating stubs that return certain pieces of test data, test objects or test numbers for the purposes of this particular test. So we've got 2 stubs, a stub reorder level and a stub warehouse object. And we've got a mock alert, and we're verifying that the send method on the alert is called at the end. Now, before we get into a discussion about why you might choose not to use a framework like Mockito to do stubbing and mocking, I thought we'll get down to the mechanics of how to do stubbing and mocking without these frameworks first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to refactor this test so that it doesn't use Mockito, and then we'll talk about at the end why sometimes that might be a good idea or why that might be necessary, and how you can sort of make that trade-off between using mocking frameworks and hand rolling your own mocks and stubs, and what that trade-off might all be about. So let's first start with these stubs. So we've got these stubs. This reorder level is stubbed here using Mockito. So we've set it up that when the calculate method of the reorder level is called with any parameter value, then we should return the number 10. In other words, the reorder level we want for this particular test is 10 for this particular product. Now, we don't need to use Mockito to create a stub version of this. We could just create an anonymous inner class for reorder level, a class that implements that interface, and have it return 10 when the calculate method is called. So if we run this test, that should work exactly as it worked before, because it means exactly the same thing. It's just that now we're not using Mockito. Similarly, we could use an anonymous inner class. This is something that's supported in most programming languages. Most programming languages. I'm looking at you, C#. And again, we can use an anonymous inner class to implement the warehouse interface to return the test product that we declared in the code above. Again, it means exactly the same thing. It just means that when the fetch product is called on our stub warehouse, we're going to return our test product, and our test is still passing. There's the proof. So stubs without mocking frameworks are relatively easy to do in most programming languages. Mocks, real mocks, mock objects that are used to test whether methods are called, a little trickier, but still it can be done. And there was a time when this is how we did it. Although in those days we didn't call them mock objects necessarily. But when we wanted to test that a method was called, we needed to create an implementation of that particular interface. And all it needs to do is to remember when the method is called and remember the parameter values that it's called with. It's just as straightforward as that. So again, we can create an anonymous inner class for our alert interface there. But this time, what we want to do is we want to remember what parameter values it's called with. So I'm going to imagine I've got an array of parameter values. Let's call it called with. And we're saying the first one in the array, the first parameter value, should be equal to the product that was passed into the send method. Now, what I'm going to do, there's a bit of jiggery-pokery that goes on here to do with visibility and scope. So because it's being referenced inside the method of this anonymous inner class, outside of it, it needs to be final, which means it can't change. So it can't just be a product. It needs to be something that we can record the product in, that itself is not going to be reassigned or changed. So what we're going to do is just create an array of products, call that called with. Actually, we could create an array of objects. That would be just as good. called with, and we're going to say to begin with, at the beginning when we run the test, that first parameter value is null. Then instead of using verify of Mockito further down here, what we can do instead is we can just old school assert that that first parameter value is equal to the test product, which it should be. In other words, if it's not, if it's null, for example, then this test will fail because it means the method wasn't called and we didn't record that it was called. Okay, let's run our test. That should still pass. Oh, no, I'm silly Jason. Hurrah for compilers. So now our test is no longer using Mockito, but before I run that test, I want to draw your attention to something. At the moment, this test takes about half a second to run if we use Mockito, and that's because of the overhead of code generation. When I run it without Mockito, hopefully we'll see an improvement in the execution time of the test. So there we go. It runs a lot faster because there's no code generation going on. Now, Mockito, I think, uses CGI lib for code generation. Other tools use ByteBuddy in Java. These tools are optimized so that they don't generate code for the same type over and over again. They do cache the generated classes. So you're not necessarily getting that same hit over and over again. Typically what you tend to find is if you've got test fixtures that are using mock objects, the first test in that fixture runs slow, often runs very slow, in the order of hundreds of milliseconds. That's in the order of an integration test. And if you have hundreds of test fixtures, and in every test fixture you're using mock objects, and maybe you're using lots of mock objects, or mocking lots of different types, then you tend to find that this overhead, this performance overhead of mocking and stubbing using something like Mockito really starts to add up to tens, sometimes even hundreds of seconds or minutes, basically. And when it comes to continuous delivery, every minute counts when we're thinking about the execution time of our tests. So if you're using mocks a lot, and I'm not going to comment on whether or not you should be using mocks a lot, but if it just so happens you do a lot of mocking, you may find that this overhead is starting to hit you, and you may find that it might be better in some cases to hand roll your own mocks and stubs that don't use code generation. Plus, you might find yourself working in a programming language that doesn't have those kinds of frameworks. Mainframe COBOL, for example, springs to mind, in which case the principle of mocks and stubs and how you can create them yourself is the same. As long as it looks the same from the outside, the stub just returns test data. A mock just remembers when its methods are called or when its functions or features are used, and that's all they really are. Then you may find that mock objects done by hand have some advantages, but they also have some disadvantages, and you can probably see already. So scroll down our test there. There's a lot more code. There's a lot more code. Now, if we're only mocking the warehouse once, for example, it's not really a big problem. But if we're mocking or stubbing an interface, for example, over and over again, then what we could do potentially is maybe extract. Let's do it for reorder level. Let's extract a helper method. Let's call it something like stub reorder level. And we can parameterize that helper method. Just run my tests like a good Boy Scout so that we can pass in different reorder levels that we want it to return. Example 10. So let's introduce a parameter. Let's call it, not to calculate, to stub reorder level, please. Yeah. Now why? And we'll call that test level. There we go. So we could extract helper code if we're doing this over and over again so that it's not appearing, it's not cluttering up our tests. We can do a similar thing with warehouse. Now, it just so happens that in Java, if you create an anonymous inner class for an interface that only has one public method, you can essentially treat it as a function, which means we could also replace this code with a lambda. Now, this is very Java specific, but we could replace that code with a lambda, and that would remove some clutter as well. But if you don't have that kind of support, or if you're stubbing or mocking interfaces that have multiple methods that would really clutter up your test code, then what you can do is you can create helper functionality instead to hide that, so it's only happening in one place. And we can do a similar trick with alert. We can turn that into a lambda like that. So there are some ways around this potential clutter that we're creating. And I'm not suggesting, this is not a video that says don't use mocking frameworks. If you're using them sparingly and if you're using them wisely, you're probably not going to have, for example, those kinds of performance problems. If you are over mocking, if you're using mocks everywhere and you're mocking hundreds of different types, then you may find the overhead of that really starts to build up and slow your tests down. And therefore, you might want to think about taking an alternative route. And the point I guess I'm making here is that doing it by hand is really no big deal. Mocking frameworks these days tend to be very powerful. They come with lots of out-of-the-box functionality. But 80%, 90% of the time, you don't need it. The main use cases for me, in my experience, for mocking and stubbing are, well, with mocking, you're just checking to see whether a method was called with certain parameter values, or whether it was not called with certain parameter values, when it shouldn't be called at all. With stubbing, you just wanted to return hard-coded data, and those really are the use cases, and you can usually do it by hand. So anyway, hand-rolling your own stubs and mocks, you don't need the mocking framework. It's not saving you a great deal of work, really. And if you use mocking frameworks a lot, you may find that the performance overhead of code generation really starts to add up. So maybe take a different route. So there you go. That's today's video. Hope you're staying safe. Until the next time.